It's my pleasure to introduce another highlight of the day, and that is the keynote by Jean Pisani-Ferry. He definitely needs no introduction, especially not in Paris, where he has done everything and been everything that you can think of. But it's also true in the wider Europe. As the founding father of Bruegel, he influenced European policymakers, but he is still one of the most influential figures in policy advice today, and his writing and analysis is always sharp and absolutely readable. He has very recently delivered a report on the green transition and financing of it to the French government. And he has summarized where he thinks that we are standing in terms of the needed climate action. We are almost 10 years from Paris now. So if I started out by saying Paris is a success, it is of course a not unmitigated success, and we know that we are not really on the right track. I think the last panel made that quite clear. So Jean, we are looking forward to hearing from you now. What do we need to do now? And maybe you also want to say a few words about what you think the next, and maybe not the next COP. So I learned from Laurent Fabius that there are good COPs and bad COPs, and probably the next one is not necessarily a good COP, but I would be curious also what you think about that. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Beatrice. Since the last panel discussed many of the issues I wanted to also to discuss in my presentation, I'll be short, and perhaps we can continue having a discussion. Okay.
Pointed over there.
Sorry?
Over there.
Over there. Oh, over there. Okay, good. So I'm intended to base my presentation on a book which is based on a conference I organized at the Peterson Institute in Washington in May last year, and which came out. And really the idea of the book was to continue this conversation we're having in Europe, and to try to have it also in the US on the macro side of the climate transition, because there are several things we don't know or which are not discussed enough on the macro side, starting with the issue of growth, the issue of fiscal implication, the labor markets, the compatibility of different type of approaches to decarbonation. And so the idea of the book was to launch this discussion. And what I'm going to do now is to sort of base myself on the introduction that I wrote for this book together with Adam Posen. The idea I want to start from is that there are fields of agreement and disagreement. I think on some issues, a lot of progress has been made. Within the research community, there is no disagreement, and even the policy community, there is not much disagreement on the physics of climate change. Obviously, there are always lunatics who consider that the climate change is an artifact. That climate change is an artifact, or it's not driven by action by mankind. but this is becoming marginal. There's much less agreement on some other issues, and I think that's where we should be focusing on. So let me start with some areas of agreement. I prepared this slide before the debate that just took place, but it very much supports the view, and I think that's an important progress, that the cost of inaction is way higher than the cost of action. We have several papers, perhaps not thousands of papers, but we have a series of papers that show that the cost of inaction is way higher. And that's important because you could always say, I'm going to develop the view that there is a cost to mitigate the climate change. So it's not a free lunch. That's what Gilles said during the panel. And I think I want to emphasize that, and that was a topic of my report to the Prime Minister together with Salma Mahfouz, that there is something that shouldn't be hidden, because to hide the cost of action would actually create disappointment if you and there's a temptation to paint the transition as a walk in the park has been important and has been emphasized by several politicians at European level, at US level, etc. And I think it's important to recognize their costs, and I'm going to go back to that. But one thing we can say with certainty now is that the cost of action is way lower than the cost of inaction at global level, at least. So that's an important starting point. So I'm representing here a graph which is taken by from a paper by Kotz, Leverman, and Vance, recent. Oh yeah. Sorry. No. This one. Yes, that would be easier. So you have the sort of that with the confidence intervals, you have two paths corresponding to warming, and the green above is the cost of action. So the cost of action, in terms, there are some GDP losses, but the GDP losses are way higher if you don't act at global level. Okay, there is also, and that was echoed in the panel, there is also increasingly the evidence that green innovation is going to, or is contributing to making the transition more affordable. And here I took evidence from a report by the International Energy Agency, a series of biannual reports that look each time at the projections of various technology for 2030. So the latest one is the one from 2023, and the dots represent the expected take-up of these technologies at global level. And so since you have different vintages for those reports, you have different dots. And what is absolutely striking is that back at the time of the Paris Agreement, there was no expectation at all that the deployment of green technologies would be anything comparable to what is expected now. So each dot corresponds to a certain vintage. It's important because sorry, you sort of seem to doubt. The dot, the bottom dot, correspond to the 2015 vintage. And the upper dots correspond to the series of vintages in the reports. And so the fact that it was expected that wind would represent the deployment of wind turbine would be less than 5% of total energy supply, total electricity supply. Now it's expected to reach 15% in 2030. So this is major, and this is sort of the counterpart to the collapse in prices that was discussed in the previous panel. So it's a major change, and this indicates that technology is on the side of decarbonization. I think that's major. That means decarbonation is going to be, for the reasons I just want to discuss, is going to present some costs, some obstacles, but technology is on the side of decarbonation. The third area of consensus is that the investment required for making this transition happen will be an issue, not so much for the private sector, but for all the large companies, but for households, and including middle-class households. This is a table that was published in the report to the Prime Minister I mentioned earlier. So essentially, we are comparing the level of investment that's required with the annual income of the low-income deciles and the middle-income deciles. And the bottom line is that investment in those, in both changing, retrofitting your house and changing the heating system, and investment into buying an electric car to replace the existing ICE car, they both represent an effort that corresponds to 1 year of income for the middle class, which is obviously not something that can be afforded without support. So there was, before the discussion we were having on the yellow vest and what it implied, that's a much higher part of income than the rise in taxes that triggered the yellow vest movement. And we had example of that in Germany, when the German government, the current German government, tried to introduce regulation on boilers, saying new boilers have to be carbon neutral, and without supporting households in this regard. You have the price of a boiler that's about 13,000 euros, of a heat pump. You can't ask even middle-class households to pay that. You can ask, upper income households to pay for that. But if you do that without supporting the investment effort, it triggers immediately a backlash, and the backlash came in the case of Germany. The fourth area of consensus is the fact that, and that we did not discuss so much, that heterogeneity in climate policies is there. When Europeans saw that the Biden administration announced that the US would rejoin the Paris Agreement, there was a sense of relief and a moment of exceptional naivety, because it was hoped that they would do it through exactly replicating the policies in the EU. Policy in the EU, it's a combination of pricing through the ETS system, plus regulation, plus subsidies. So we had this discussion on what is most effective. I tend to think that the EU has a good mix, because announcing a price of carbon for the future, a pass for the price of carbon, would have suffered from credibility issues. I think it's much more credible to say by 2035 you're not going to be allowed to put on the market a car which is not carbon neutral. But that's the way we did in Europe. In the US, they did in a completely different way, without much regulation, at least at federal level, and without pricing at federal level. And the key instrument at federal level was the Inflation Reduction Act, which was essentially subsidies. So it has worked. And here you have the share of clean investment in total US private investment. So clean, it's a narrow definition of clean investment. There are many investments that are just neutral. But in this narrow definition of clean investment, it has risen from about 2% of total investment to 5.5% of total investment in the course of 3 years. So this is remarkable. So in a way, the IRA works, but at a cost that's very high fiscally. We don't have exactly the numbers, but it's when it was announced with a budget tag, but it was an open-ended scheme, and the fact that it has worked means that the cost of this scheme exceeds the forecast. Now, Europe cannot do that, or doesn't want to do that, and I'm going to go back to this question of the choice of mix in Europe. But what's clear is that the strategies adopted by the US and Europe are not at all the same, and the problems of compatibility. There was a mention of the CBAM in the discussion before. A massive problem of compatibility, and if we add China had also a very different strategy that put much more emphasis on the supply side, on the industrial policy dimension, and less on the demand side. Now, the last point on consensus, and that goes back to a discussion we had. Sorry. Is the amount of investment that's needed to trigger this transition to net zero. So we don't have a very good estimate of the global investment because, for example, the US doesn't have an estimate of the amount of investment that's required because the US relies on subsidies, it doesn't rely on planning. So you can, the fact that you have a precise target and you can actually, measure the investments that are required to reach this target gives you an indication of the amount of investment that's needed. So that what we have in Europe, that we have in France, but as was said, the sort of numbers are roughly the same. So it's 2 to 3% of GDP. Now, in the developing countries, in the emerging countries especially, the amount of investment is twice higher as a proportion of GDP. And add to that the fact that the cost of capital for developing countries, excluding China, is twice higher than what it is in the north. So that's in a nutshell, that's the challenge we're facing. Those are numbers by a paper by Songwe Stern and Bhattacharya and the IEA, they're considered, the best estimate there is. Now, if you want to sort of find a way of assessing how much it would represent for the global economy, so the total GDP of the world is about 100 trillion. So that means that the cost, if you assume that it would be something like 3-4% of global GDP, and again, we don't have the numbers for all the economies, that would represent 400 billion per year. So, which, sorry, I got it wrong. That would represent 4% of 100 trillion. That's 4 trillion. Yeah, 4,000, 3 to 4,000 billion. And so that's a part on which there is no clear disagreement. Now, next, the points of contention. And I'm going to select 4, some of which have been already mentioned. The first one is the fact that the medium-term growth impact of the transition is something on which there is no clear agreement. The second, that the range of estimate for the price of carbon that's needed to trigger this transition is a wide dispersion. The third is the choice of instrument to incentivize the private sector transition. And the fourth is the fiscal dimension. Let me go relatively quickly on those. So, the impact of climate action on growth, it's something on which there is a certain lack of clarity. And to me, the problem is that the models with which this impact has been evaluated, are way too complex. They're designed to essentially support, facilitate the dialogue between economists and engineers. And I think that's, in that regard, they serve a purpose. But they're way too complex, and they hide the fundamental mechanism. To me, the fundamental mechanism, the main one, it's not the only one, but the main one, is the substitution of capital for fossil fuels. So the capital intensity of burning fossil fuels is relatively low. And that's why there's so much reliance on coal and so much reliance on fossil fuels in the emerging countries, because the cost of capital is high and because the savings are low. So if you change that, and if you move to an energy system that relies much more on capital, you're going to gain efficiency in the long run, but in the meantime, you're going to have to shoulder higher investment. And what is important is that this investment is not an investment that contributes to gaining labor productivity or to increasing your capacity, your output, potential output. It's an investment that's entirely devoted to triggering this substitution. So take the case of India, and there's a coal-fired power plant, and they have to replace it by solar panels or by wind turbines. This requires an important investment. The figure for this investment are those I gave in the previous slide. And the impact of this investment, it's going to increase demand, but it's not going to increase supply correspondingly. So if you want to have a look at that, the best illustration I found is this graph from the British Climate Change Committee, which compares, in a net zero scenario, gives the amounts of investment that's above the line, and that the savings on operation costs, OPEX, that's below the line. And what's immediately visible in this graph is that you've got to invest much more in order to gradually deliver savings on OPEX. Which means that in the meantime, in the first period, you're not going to have gains in terms of output capacity, in terms of labor productivity. You're going to have investment, but with not a much counterpart in terms of lower OPEX. The lower OPEX, they come eventually, but they come after something like 15 years. And the fact that they come after 15 years means you have a transition that's a hard transition to go through. So that's what I think is essential. And the implication is that, you have those mechanisms in all cases. Here is a graph, is a table taken from the Draghi report, which, so the Draghi report, as you may know, has something like 750, 800 billion additional investment per year, but of which 450 billion are linked to the energy transition and the achievement of climate neutrality. So that's completely consistent with what I was saying about the mechanisms. The second point of contention, and this is more surprising, is about the price of carbon that would trigger decarbonation, assuming the only instrument would be the price of carbon. And here we have, it's not an issue of methodology. I mean, there were methodological debate in the past, but they're mostly gone. The standard approach is to take the objectives in terms of carbon neutrality and to determine the price level that would trigger this decarbonation. But nevertheless, you still have wide range of estimates. You have a paper that by John Hassler, Per Krusel, and Connie Olofsson that speaks of, and I heard Connie Olofsson presenting this paper yesterday again, saying a $20 per ton price carbon tax would achieve significant results. So that's very low. So the reason is probably that it would be a way at global level to sort of phase out carbon, the coal, sorry. But it's a long way from achieving the total carbon neutrality. That's the goal. And it contrasts enormously with other estimates, like the one by Pierre Wunsch for Belgium, $300 per ton, or the U.S. Environment Protection Agency, which puts it at the social cost of carbon at around $200 per ton. So that's the difficulty, and I think the degree of disagreement is way too high. We need to do better to reach a consensus on what would be needed to achieve decarbonization because it's so central. The third point of contention, I'm almost done, is the choice of policy instruments, so that essentially I discussed that when comparing US and Europe. I think there is agreement on the value of a mixed strategy, but there is no agreement on the weighting of the different instruments. And let me finish with the fiscal consequences of the transition. So as was discussed in the previous panel, there is an agreement on the amount of investment that is required. There is much less agreement on the distribution between public and private investment. And on top of public investment, there are a number of fiscal consequences that have to be factored in. The fact that fossil fuel consumption is a source of tax revenues in many countries. The fact that the fiscal consequences of different instruments that are not the same. There is a need to finance public investment, and there is the need to support cash constraints agents through subsidies. So even if it's not public investment, it has to, in the end, to be borne by the public sector, because otherwise the decarbonation will not take place. So and on top of that, you could add the fiscal cost of adaptation. So it's a major issue in a fiscally constrained environment, and especially for developing countries, and especially also for Europe. So in Europe, we are having what I think can be characterized as a perfect storm. There is a remaining investment gap to achieve carbon neutrality, which is huge. We have public investment needs that amount to 0.5% to 1% of GDP, depending on the country, because the share of the public sector is not the same. You have competing demands on public budgets, especially with defense and research and development for innovation and adaptation. And in front of that, we have a phase out of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. We're going to lose 30 billion per year in the next 2 years. We have the need for fiscal consolidation, which is triggered by the fiscal situation after the moments in which fiscal policy was mobilized to help to help withstand the COVID crisis and the energy crisis. And we have the new fiscal rules, the new fiscal frameworks that has introduces, in my view, significant progress improvement with respect to the old fiscal framework, but which doesn't make room for green investment. I do not advocate a blanket exemption for green investment. I think that will be a disaster. But I think there is a case could have been made for having introduced in the fiscal framework conditions for certain investment to be conditionally on examination and assessment by the European Commission, could have been exempted from the fiscal rules. The reason for that is that it's a temporary investment effort. It's not a permanent effort, so it does not affect, in principle, sustainability if it's applied, if sustainability is considered in terms of trends. I mean, the problem with sustainability is that if you have a growth rate of your expenditures that exceeds the growth rate of your revenues, at least the primary expenditure in the total revenues, then this is something that cannot be sustained. But if you have a temporary surge in investment, and that applies both to actually the defense equipment and to the climate transition, a case could have been made and should have been made to exempt those investments from the strict implementation of the rules. This hasn't been done, and I'm worried that all that means a perfect storm is coming, and the contradiction between fiscal consolidation and the climate transition is bound to dominate the agenda in the coming years. Let me stop here. I have been too long.